the distinguished lecture series, an initiative exploring Gandhi's life, philosophy, and legacy, that began exactly 2 years ago on October 2nd, has till date completed 8 very illuminating and insightful sessions. We have been extremely fortunate to benefit from the deliberations by some of the world's best intellectual minds working on Gandhi currently. The illustrious panel includes Professor Akhil Bilgrami, Professor Faisal Devji, Professor Bhiku Parekh, Professor Dennis Dalton, Professor Ajay Skaria, Professor Karuna Mantena, Professor Aishwarya Kumar, and Professor Uday Singh Mehta, who just spoke last month. It's a pleasure and honor to have two very eminent scholars with us today. We welcome you, sir, on behalf of Gandhi Studies Circle. Professor Joseph, who will chair the important session today, is currently serving as the director, Sri Jamnalal Bajaj Memorial Library and Research Center at Wardha in Maharashtra. He's an eminent Gandhian scholar and has served as the Dean of Studies and Research for 15 years at Indian Gandhian Studies at Wardha. He has edited and contributed as an author in several books and journals. This includes some very important works on Gandhi. Professor Vinay Lal, I know, needs no introduction, is a keynote speaker for today, but for the benefit of few students who are today witnessing him for the first time, let me share that he's a cultural critic, a writer, blogger, and a professor of history at Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. His intellectual and research interests include South Asian history, comparative colonial histories, the politics of knowledge system, cinema, culture of sexuality, the global histories of nonviolence, and the thought of Mahatma Gandhi. All through his writings, Mahatma Gandhi has remained a topic of special interest to him. He is currently completing a 2-volume collection of his essays on Gandhi that will be published shortly by Orient Black Swan. To students who have an interest in Gandhi, I must say that they must read his works. His writings capture the complex worldview of Gandhi with such lucidity and critical insights that is often a rarity in the hagiographic and aphoristic description on Gandhi today. Professor Lal has a penchant of picking categories and developing a deeper conceptual and philosophical framework. Today, he has chosen to speak on the concept of care that has become quite popular in the recent times in the realm of philosophy. What are the contours of this developing a philosophy of care? How does it place itself in relation to what are today called the ethics of care? And how does it take account of nursing care as a discipline understood in its social, pedagogical, and epistemological dimension, taking a cue from Gandhi's lifelong passion for nursing? Vinay Lal's lecture today will dwell on developing Gandhi's idea of care. What relationship does the ethics of care have to do with ethics in politics? Are the two correlated? And if so, how? Through what Vinay Lal suggests, a politics of nourishing, he seeks to explore this dimension of Gandhi. We are all quite excited to hear Professor Lal, but before I hand over the proceedings to the chair, I request the participants to keep their audios off during the conduct of the event. After the lecture, we'll have an important and a small interactive session. This will be moderated by our friend Julcia. Not taking much time, may I now request Professor C.V. Joseph to offer his preliminary remarks and conduct the proceedings further. Professor Joseph.
Thank you so much, Sanjay Kumar, for the brief introduction about this program. This session will be very illuminating one because I am sitting in a room where Gandhi taken care of the people, that is known as the Kishore Nivas. Kishorlal Masruwala was affected by asthma, and in Sevagram Ashram Pradhishthan, we can see a different building other than the usual mud buildings. Next to me is another iconic symbol where Gandhi treated the Prajure Shastri as Sanskrit scholar. And I consider it as a great privilege and honor to chair these sessions. And I am constantly reminded when I move out of this room and I see the Prajure Shastri's kuti. And Professor Vinay Lal will enlighten us on this very important area. Now I request Professor Vinay Lal to enlighten on the subject. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by expressing my thanks to Dr. Sanjeev Kumar for first the invitation and second for the very generous introduction. And thank you as well to the Gandhi Studies Circle and the Zakir Hussain College at the University of Delhi. I've had the pleasure of speaking at Zakir Hussain College in person before, so this brings back some memories of what are now called the pre-COVID days, right? So everything is now pre-COVID, post-COVID, but we are actually in COVID. So I think we'd have to rethink the chronology, but that's a different subject. However, COVID is inescapable because, of course, I have to begin on a personal note by saying that the subject of nursing and Gandhi came to mind partly because of the coronavirus pandemic. Since we were hearing about the heroic work being done by frontline workers, as they're called, in every country, and nurses were undoubtedly a part of that, it came to mind that perhaps it would be worthwhile exploring to some degree Gandhi's own passion for nursing right from the outset. I mean, if you look at the autobiography, I will not here get into this question. This is a question that comes up repeatedly, particularly in the context of what Gandhi did in South Africa, about how Gandhi may have shaped the autobiography and the book called Satyagraha in South Africa. Some of you are aware of the fact that both these books were written in the 1920s. And so some people have said that Gandhi actually cleaned up his past. And it has also been suggested that when he talks about his passion for nursing, his love for nursing, that there are many things that Gandhi actually put in later on in order to make himself into a more attractive figure. This is not necessarily argued apropos of nursing. It's certainly argued apropos of Gandhi's questions on race, but which is, of course, a very different subject. In some respects, we will see that it is not, because you will see during the course of my talk how I bring in the question of race and racism as well, because it does actually have a bearing when one is trying to understand the contours of Gandhi's life. The second thing it needs to be said is that I am actually, as I think a few of you are aware, the people who joined a bit early, when about 5-10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, when I mentioned that I was actually in South Africa, and it's 7:30 a.m. here. Now, Gandhi was undoubtedly at his sharpest at 7:30 a.m., perhaps at 5 a.m., but I'm not at my sharpest at 7:30 a.m. The day usually begins for me much later on than 7:30 a.m., but nevertheless, I'll try to do the best I can. Thirdly, to continue on this informal note before I launch into my formal talk, I don't know how many are aware that 30th January, which of course is National Martyrs' Day in India, the day that Gandhi was assassinated is also actually National Leprosy Day in India. It is also National Leprosy Day, and this is not a coincidence because, of course, Gandhi, as has already been, we've already been alerted to that by Professor Sibi Joseph, Gandhi was someone who, in fact, actually looked after uh, patients, after lepers, patients of leprosy. And all of you are historically aware of the fact. I mean, there are even biblical connotations, and even in the Semitic world, this is a key issue that lepers were always um, um, uh, not simply marginalized, but in European cities, if you look at the structure of European cities, they were actually put in colonies which were on the outskirts of town, right? So one of the things that Gandhi attempted to do was to, in fact, actually bring them back into the orbit of everyday life. And I bring this to your attention because even the World Health Organization has long been actually contemplating having World Leprosy Day, or possibly either on 2nd October or 30th January. Um, Finally, to continue on the anecdotal side, um, when Gandhi founded the Natal Indian Congress, so long before, of course, Gandhi became involved with the Indian National Congress, which, needless to say, he didn't found, but which he transformed entirely into a mass organization. But before that, he founded the Natal Indian Congress, and it is reported that when the initial meeting of the Natal Indian Congress took place, he saw a group of people standing some distance away from where he was gathering the crowd. So he urged them to come and join the rest of the rest of the meeting, and he was told that they were not willing to join the meeting, that they would continue. So Gandhi walks over to them and says, "Why don't you join the meeting?" And they said, "Gandhi bhai, don't come any closer to us. We are lepers. We are lepers." This is right here where I'm speaking from, literally a few kilometers away. This was the founding meeting of the Natal Indian Congress. So he actually uh, walks right up to them, starts touching them, and then asks them, "Well, what have your experiences been like?" They tell him that we haven't had any medical care, no one is willing to look after us, so forth and so on. All right. So all of this, in some ways, has also touched me, and I use the word touch because, again, that's going to be a crucial word in the course of this talk. So this lecture is called A Philosophy of Care, Gandhi, the Ethics and Poetics of Nursing. It's a very preliminary investigation because there is a different kind of philosophical literature which I will seek to explore. And this invitation came really at very short notice. So I was pretty much already on the road, and I haven't had time to develop some of the thoughts, but I had written out this paper early on. Now, though Mohandas Gandhi occupies no place as such in histories of nursing in India, certainly not in what are called academic or official histories, it should not come as a surprise to those who have reflected on his long career as perhaps the principal exponent in history of the idea of ahimsa, that he displayed a great affinity for nursing and thought of it as a noble way of rendering service to humankind. Gandhi's capacious understanding of ahimsa has been reduced, unfortunately. Incidentally, Sanjeev, I keep on getting a message here saying that I'm not audible because there's some problem. Is that the case?
I don't think so. There must be some problem at the other end. I think you may continue. I think
Oh, I see. Okay,
quite
because
clear,
I keep, oh, okay, because I keep on
there
getting
must be some network issue. No, please.
I
I'm
see.
sorry
Okay.
if you don't get disturbed. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, all right. So Gandhi's capacious understanding of ahimsa has been reduced in common thinking, I was saying, to his articulation of non-violent resistance to oppression, rendered by the term satyagraha. But for Gandhi, non-violence, ahimsa, I prefer to use the word ahimsa, as I'll explain in a moment, was a way of being in the world and the unimpeachable law of existence itself. And I would like to remind all of you of the famous debate. I think it's one of the most iconic debates in the 20th century between Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, and Mohandas Gandhi. And I'm referring here to the first debate, not the debate on the occasion of the Bihar earthquake. And the debate I'm referring to is when Gandhi had launched the non-cooperation movement, and then Tagore actually responded with an article in Modern Review called "The Cult of the Charkha," and Gandhi then responded to that. And one of the things that Gandhi pointed out was that Tagore had a fear of the negative, because keep in mind, of course, that non-violence. Well, what is non-violence? So if you ask a student, the student will say it's the negation of violence. And of course, if we define it in that way, we give a certain kind of ontological primacy to violence itself, right? To violence itself. I mean, it's almost like the Augustinian problem of good and evil, because evil is the privation of good, the deprivation of good, but good is not the absence of evil. Okay, it is not, because good doesn't need evil. Good is sufficient unto itself. So here we get into this complicated question of which has ontological primacy. And I think in Sanskrit, what Mohandas Gandhi was trying to point out to Tagore was, in Sanskrit, the negative does not bear the same unfortunate burden that it does in the English language. All right, so that is why ahimsa is, it seems to me, always the word that one should really be using rather than non-violence. Now, ahimsa is nothing but love, a mode of ministering to the soul and nursing the wounds of others and those which are self-inflicted. One has to nurse oneself as well before one can nurse others. Yet Gandhi also had a withering critique of modern medicine and doctors, a critique that does not sit well with the medical profession, though it is notable that his critique did not extend to nursing, even if some of his own thoughts on nursing do not conform to the textbook prescriptions of nursing. He viewed modern medicine as animated by the evil of vivisection and plagued by the profit motive, but his critique of it has other socio-ethical, political, and philosophical dimensions, only some of which I can explore in this paper. For instance, in his 1909 treatise Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule, which is increasingly being viewed as the most fundamental expression of his ideas, but which still lacks the traction and recognition of his autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth, his critique in Hind Swaraj of the figure of the doctor was fundamentally rooted in Gandhi's deep suspicion of what he calls the third party. There are some scholars who have written about the third party. Professor Udit Singh Mehta was mentioned as my predecessor in terms of this series. He's talked about it. But in fact, the phrase third party is used by Gandhi himself. So if you turn to Hind Swaraj in chapter 10, which is called The Condition of India, the Hindus and the Mohammedans, he references the third party there and says, quote, "The fact is that we have become enslaved and therefore quarrel and like to have our quarrels decided by a third party." Right? So the British are the third party between the Hindus and the Muslims. And similarly, Gandhi is going to make an argument about the third party when he has a critique of modern medicine, when he has a critique of railways, and so on. Just as lawyers come between two adversaries, so lawyers are the third party and profit only themselves, and just as the British drove a wedge between Hindus and Muslims and set themselves up as a transcendent peacekeeper, so the doctor appeared to Gandhi as someone who distances the patient from his or her own body, The doctor is the third party between you and yourself, your conception of your body. He imagines the circumstances under which a visit to a doctor becomes necessary. Quote, I have indulged in vice, I contract a disease, a doctor cures me, the odds are that I shall repeat the vice. Had the doctor not intervened, nature would have done its work, and I would have acquired mastery over myself, would have been freed from vice, and would have become happy. End quote. Happy is not what others have been. With Gandhi's critique of modern medicine and its practitioners, and many have dismissed Hind Swaraj and certainly his critique of railways, hospitals, and the legal profession as an ill-informed diatribe. However, his position on modern medicine is easily mischaracterized. In accepting an invitation to inaugurate the opening of a medical college in Delhi in 1921, Gandhi offered his, quote, humble tribute to the spirit of research that fires the modern scientists, while adding this proviso, quote, my quarrel is not against that spirit. My complaint is against the direction that the spirit has taken. It has chiefly concerned itself with the exploration of laws and methods conducing to the merely material advancement of its clientele, end quote. It is not without reluctance, he says, that he had accepted the invitation. This is Tibia College, at the inauguration of which he was invited. Not only because the movement of non-cooperation that he was leading had rendered it difficult for the viceroy to honor his word to preside over the opening, but Gandhi thought that the audience should be aware that, quote, I hold strange views on medicine and hospitals and have scrupulously avoided any special contact with such institutions. And yet, as he told a German visitor who met with him in 1937, he did not, quote, despise all medical treatment. I know we can learn a lot from the West about safe maternity and the care of infants, end quote. Now notice that he says what we can learn from the West here is about safe maternity and the care of infants. He's not talking about medical procedures. He's not talking about specialists, the division of labor in the medical world from which we can learn. No. And this is very instructive because what Gandhi understood, something that all historians of medicine, actually all historians of what we might call well-being, have understood, namely that 90% of all the advance that took place from the late 19th century onwards until, let's say, relatively recent times, right? 90% of it owed everything simply to improvements in sanitation, nutrition, and hygiene. If then his outlook on medicine still remains unacceptable to many, on the question of nursing, however, he adopted views that may be rather more agreeable and even admirable to most people, most particularly at a time when the world has gone through a very turbulent period, marked, of course, by the coronavirus pandemic. When at a time, that is, when healthcare practitioners are being celebrated the world over as frontline workers who have put their lives at risk. He might have thought incidentally that the effortless ease with which we have all fallen into speaking of the frontline workers, at least in the Anglophone world, suggests the extent to which we have unthinkingly absorbed the vocabulary of war into our thinking, even if he would have understood the spirit in which we have all been called to recognize and applaud the altruistic behavior of those, particularly nurses, who have become part of the core of essential workers. Indeed, it is not too much to say, as shall become apparent in due course, that he thought of nurses, not doctors, as essential. And in this respect, he seems to be characteristically contrarian in his thinking. Now, at the time that Gandhi transitioned into adulthood, one name entirely dominated the public perception of nursing. at least in the Anglophone world and the British Empire. And this is, of course, the name of Florence Nightingale. Let me just anecdotally tell you something about Florence Nightingale here, which is that Florence Nightingale, became what you might call a venerated figure in the Anglophone world, and particularly back in England itself. Venerated to the extent that shortly after when she was still, incidentally, only in her 40s or so, she abandoned the public sphere. So she had become very prominent, and you'll hear a little bit more about that during the Crimean War in the mid-1800s. And then when she came back to England, she actually became a recluse. But prime ministers, former viceroys of India, all of them, they had to line up to see her in her bedroom, because that's the only place where she received visitors for 30, 35 years. She never stepped outside of her house. She became a kind of a recluse. And that's very interesting, because we'd have to consider, as I said, the whole question of to what extent did she nurse herself, right? That you have to nurse yourself before you go to nurse others. But I mention all of this because Nightingale was a very legendary figure, and she had something that I cannot explore in this paper, a critical role to play in the transformation of nursing, not just in the West, but in India itself. Her writings on India have now been put together in 2 volumes comprising 2,000 pages in the collected works of Florence Nightingale. Now, Gandhi penned a tribute to her in Gujarati in his newspaper Indian Opinion several years before her death in August 1910. Though it is a short piece, it is vintage Gandhi and deserving of a much lengthier commentary than what I can offer at present. Some of the language is characteristic of his writing, where he speaks of those whom he views as pious and selfless. Quote, there were in those days very few men who considered it an act of mercy and merit to succor the wounded. It was at such a time that this lady Florence Nightingale came upon the scene and did good work worthy of an angel descended from heaven. End quote. Very Victorian prose, right? He describes how, through the selfless care of the wounded British soldiers at Scutari, so this is in the Crimean region, Nightingale and the nurses trained under her immediately brought the mortality rate among the wounded down to 31% from 42% and eventually to 5%. But he loses neither the opportunity to castigate the British government, which he says was, as usual, not alive to the situation when war first broke out in Crimea, nor to press forward with his own homilies on what might be viewed as the basic principles of nursing. Though the results Nightingale produced were miraculous, he says, they can be easily visualized. If bleeding could be stopped, the wounds bandaged, and the requisite diet given, the lives of many thousands would doubtless be saved. The only thing necessary was kindness and nursing, which Miss Nightingale provided. Now, there is nothing on record to suggest that Gandhi had read Nightingale's short manual, Notes on Nursing, published in 1860, but there can be little doubt that he would have been in agreement with its most fundamental propositions. Nightingale wrote, quote, the very elements of what constitutes good nursing are as little understood for the well as for the sick. The same laws of health or of nursing, for they are in reality the same, obtain among the well as among the sick. Right? Now this is we need to pause and think, right? The same laws of health or of nursing, for they are in reality the same, obtain among the well as among the sick. Which is to say that those who are well also have to be nursed, because what she's putting forward is a conception of nursing which is not simply tending to physical wounds or even to mental anguish, although that is not usually viewed as within the ambit of nursing. that the conception of nursing she's putting forward is a conception of a holistic being, which I would say is very different from the technical conception of nursing, which still predominates worldwide and especially in hospitals. I'm sure all of you can recall incidents, perhaps the students less so than others, because they might not have visited hospitals that often. But I can't remember how many times I visited hospitals escorting one parent or the other or someone else, where one always heard the complaint that, well, yes, the nurse did this or that, but they were very rude, because they're not working with a holistic conception, you see. Now, Nightingale's very short manual is already alerting us to something quite different in the domain of care. Nevertheless, in the matter of nursing, as in many other domains, Gandhi was essentially self-taught. He may not have read the manual, and he was certainly not formally trained as a nurse, but he was essentially self-taught. When he was 16 years old, he nursed his father, who was then suffering from a fistula and was confined to the bed. I had the duties of a nurse, Gandhi recalled many years later in his autobiography, which mainly consisted in dressing the wound, giving my father his medicine, and compounding drugs whenever they had to be made up at home. Every night, Gandhi massaged his father's legs. Quote, I love to do this service. I do not remember ever having neglected it. End quote. But then came what Gandhi himself called the dreadful night. Overtaken by the carnal urge, Gandhi left his father's bedside to share the bed with his wife, Kasturba, to whom he was married when both were 13 years old. He had been with her for all of 5 minutes when a knock came on the door. His father had expired. In the centenary year of Gandhi's birth, in an influential book called Gandhi's Truth on the Origins of Militant Nonviolence, Erik Erikson would go on to argue controversially that the incident and Gandhi's guilt over it exercised an incalculable influence on his life. Whatever the merits of Erikson's view, Gandhi's interest in nursing can be traced to this incident. There would be other occasions, far too numerous to enumerate, where Gandhi would find the opportunity to nurture his instinct for nursing within the ambit of the larger extended family. In 1893, Gandhi had left for South Africa, and what is not often remembered is that he returned to India on a number of occasions. So in 1896, he found himself in Bombay, which was then being decimated by bubonic plague. And he chose to spend days and nights by the bedside of his brother-in-law, who had taken seriously ill and whose wife, that is Gandhi's sister, was not equal to nursing him. Gandhi could not save his life. However, as he was to write years later in his autobiography, quote, my aptitude for nursing gradually developed into a passion. My aptitude for nursing gradually developed into a passion, so much so that it often led me to neglect my work. And on occasions, I engaged not only my wife, but the whole household in such service, end quote. In 1918, when India was struck by the so-called Spanish flu, this is the influenza epidemic, which is estimated today to have killed up to 15 to 18 million people in India alone. Gandhi was taken seriously ill. There's a book by Laura Spinney where she says that Gandhi himself was struck by the flu, by the influenza epidemic, but that's incorrect. Some have thought that he too had been afflicted with this malignant influenza, but the doctor declared that he was suffering from nothing more than a nervous breakdown due to extreme weakness. Though Gandhi remained free of infection, his own nearness to death was brought home to him by the fact that he lost his grandson, Shanti Lal, as well as his daughter-in-law, Gulab, to the plague. To the extent that scholars have paid any attention whatsoever to Gandhi's lifelong passion for nursing among a wider public, the narrative generally begins with his initiative in setting up an Indian ambulance corps consisting of 1,100 volunteers during the Boer War in South Africa in 1899. We must recall once again that Gandhi had made South Africa his home, and he spent 20 years here before returning to India for good in January 1915. The South African years are vitally important, more particularly if we consider that Gandhi had acquired experience of nursing under conditions of a pneumonic plague epidemic, which somewhat resonate with the contemporary experience of COVID-19. In 1904, as he details in his book Satyagraha in South Africa, and this is where, let me remind you, the claim that he cleaned it up, right? So remember, this book is 1928. So in other words, he's completed this book nearly 60 years after he was born and 14 years after he left South Africa for good. Now, he got there in 1893. So 1928 is when Satyagraha in South Africa is published. So the allegation there is that he recrafted his memory. He cleaned it up in various respects. And I want you to bear this in mind because it's not a claim that I agree with here, but I want you to bear that in mind when I discuss what happens during the Boer War. So in 1904, as he details in his book, Satyagraha in South Africa, which recounts the struggle waged by Indians in South Africa to oppose racism and gain political recognition, Gandhi was settled in Johannesburg, where he had established a law practice. Early that year, he was to write, quote, "A virulent plague broke out among the Indians in Johannesburg. I was fully engaged in nursing the patients." He describes his own contribution modestly. However, his autobiography offers a somewhat more detailed account in two short chapters entitled The Black Plague I and The Black Plague II. Gandhi and his friends took possession of a vacant house by breaking its lock. One doesn't imagine Gandhi as a minor lawbreaker, so this is amusing, right? He takes possession of this vacant house, breaks its lock, and shifts 23 Indians suffering from the scourge, nursing them through the night. Now, notice the insight there, right? Because what do? You have to isolate. And he understood that. He's not formally trained. He's never had any experience as such, either in the medical profession, but he understood something. The following day, the local municipality made available a vacant and dirty warehouse, which they placed at Gandhi's disposal, leaving the Indians to clean the premises. So he talks about how, and so now he could nurture another passion, which is picking up the broom and start cleaning, right? Which most other Indians wouldn't do, certainly not upper caste Hindus, right? So he goes around cleaning up this dirty premises and turns it into a hospital ward, right? Hauls beds into them and turns it into, quote, a temporary hospital. The municipality later lent the services of a nurse whose name Gandhi did not recall years later when he wrote his books, but who has since been identified as Emily Blake. She became infected and died a few years later. Ironically, the only person who died in that group was this professional nurse, the only nurse to die in that outbreak. The following year, an official account on the plague appeared under the name of the Johannesburg Plague Committee Report. It suggests that neither Miss Blake nor any of the Indians, including Gandhi, providing care for the sick, were furnished any protective equipment or masks. The report tacitly recognizes the part played by Gandhi and Dr. William Godfrey, a physician practicing in Johannesburg who had come to the aid of the Indians, in raising the alarm and preventing the plague from taking hold in other parts of the city. Here, the value of isolating infected persons was immediately appreciated by Dr. Godfrey and Mahatma Gandhi, says a recent scholarly study of the Plague Commission's report, one of the very few that has ever been undertaken, and, quote, progress was made before municipal authorities first realized that the epidemic was fully underway, end quote. Still, another research essay is yet more pronounced in underscoring Gandhi's capacious understanding of the circumstances that had no small part in precipitating the plague among Indian indentured workers, whose health in the best of conditions was feeble, and the role he played in bringing the epidemic under control. Delving into previously unexplored correspondence, the author of this study, Tim Capone, notes that since early February 1904, Gandhi had sought to bring to the attention of Dr. Porter, this Dr. Porter is a medical officer for health for Johannesburg, the extremely unsatisfactory conditions under which the Indians lived and the municipality's gross negligence in safeguarding their health. Writing to Dr. Porter on February 11th of 1904, Gandhi described, quote, the shocking state of the Indian location. Rooms appear to be overcrowded beyond description, and the sanitary services had deteriorated. Quote, from what I believe, noted Gandhi rather ominously, I believe the mortality in the location has increased considerably, and it seems to me that if the present state of things continues, an outbreak of some epidemic disease is merely a question of time. End quote. Capone goes so far as to say that Gandhi helped save, these are his words, not just the Indian community, but also the city itself. Significant as Gandhi's interventions appear to have been to stem the rise of the plague in Johannesburg in 1904, his volunteer work during the Zulu rebellion is still more remarkable for what it reveals about the ethics of Gandhi's nursing. Now, it is necessary first to revisit his work on the battlefield in 1899. This is the battlefield that I will be visiting tomorrow. Okay? During the Boer War, to which I have adverted briefly. Though there is an account of this in Gandhi's own writings, the apparent anomaly of him appearing as a nurse in aid of the British is also explored in what is possibly the most exhaustive history of the Boer War by the British historian Thomas Pakenham. And I quote Pakenham here, quote, ahead of the field hospitals marched a strange procession. He writes, 2,000 volunteer stretcher bearers who were also political symbols. About 800 were members of Natal's Indian community, led by a 28-year-old barrister. Gandhi had announced in Durban that the Indian community wished to give active expression to their loyalty to the empire. Unable to fight, they would serve as stretcher bearers. Years later, men might wonder why Mahatma Gandhi, the anti-imperialist and the arch-pacifist, had served as a non-combatant in an imperial war. At the same time, it seemed natural enough to the British. Here was one of the subject peoples showing the solidarity of the colored races in the white man's war. End quote. Now, let me just elaborate upon this very briefly, particularly for the benefit of the students, because I'm sure that the Gandhi scholars who are present there know all the intricacies of this debate. And in particular, because there is, as some of you may be aware, there are a number of books that have been written, particularly one book by two South African Indian scholars, which is critical of Gandhi's years in South Africa, very critical of his years in South Africa. And one of the arguments that is advanced there is that Gandhi really never did anything for the rights of Indians as such, certainly not for the rights of indentured Indians, but rather that he was always concerned with the rights of Indians only as subjects of the British Empire. Okay, and of course here we have to remember, number one, not that this is really the way in which one might possibly issue a rejoinder, but we do have to remember that in the early 1900s, there is no one, even in India, who is advocating for complete independence, for Purna Swaraj, right? There's no one. That was not the position that was being advocated by anyone. But let's leave that aside. What is important here is that Gandhi is in South Africa. The question is, why does he even volunteer his services, okay, as a non-combatant to an empire that was clearly an empire that was oppressive, that did not actually confer rights on Indians at all. And of course, one of the things that we can argue is that we would have to really look at Gandhi's conception of rights and duties. Rights is a very modern kind of language. What I would call rights talk is a modern kind of talk. It's post-World War II. We did not typically speak of rights, and Gandhi, of course, actually preferred to speak often in the language of duties because he understood that duties precede rights. But what is also important here is this, that if Indians were to make any claim as subjects of the British Empire, then clearly they had to produce some work, so to speak, as subjects of the British Empire. And Gandhi's conception here was that it is precisely nursing that enables one to do that, right? Because nursing does not distinguish between the good and the evil. If Adolf Hitler came to a nurse, the nurse would be duty bound to actually administer to Adolf Hitler, or Joseph Stalin, and deliberately picking people who appear to be monstrous, right? Because recall also that Gandhi's view is that no one is monstrous. Their acts may be monstrous, but no one is actually monstrous. Right? But it seems to me that this elaboration is necessary in order to understand why he took the position that he did. Now, what work did they do? The work that they did on that battlefield is described, but barely so, in the 2 lines that Gandhi gives to it. In his own autobiography, he gives only 2 lines to it, really. Okay. At a critical moment, despite assurances that the ambulance corps would not be required to serve within the firing line, Gandhi and the 1,100 Indians, 800 of whom were still indentured, were asked, 800 of whom are still indentured at this point, they're not free, were asked if they would be willing to take the risk of removing the wounded from the line of fire. They accepted the risk without hesitation. Quote, during those days, we had to march from 20 to 25 miles a day, bearing the wounded on stretchers. This is what Gandhi wrote. And incidentally, a plaque has recently been put up on that battlefield, recognizing the role of the Indian stretcher bearers. Remarkably, Gandhi rendered his assistance to the British, though his own sympathies were with the Boer at this time. As he explained in his autobiography, I felt that if I demanded rights as a British citizen, it was also my duty as such to partake in the defense of the British Empire, end quote. Now, less than 10 years later, Gandhi again found himself raising the Natal Volunteer Ambulance Corps, occasioned by what is known as the Zulu Rebellion. The year 1906 is recognized by scholars as pivotal and doubtless a transformative moment in his life. I wonder if there's anyone here who's listening in recognizes that year, the signal importance of that year for Gandhi, right? He took a vow of celibacy, and abjured all sexual relations, even with his wife, for the rest of his life. And this on the grounds that he had come to the conviction that, quote, procreation and the consequent care of children were inconsistent with public service, end quote. Now, it is not possible at this juncture to delve into the intricacies of this decision, except to say that, oddly enough, that many scholars who have probed the subject of Gandhi's views on sexuality have not considered the manner in which the vow came to fruition when he was nursing the wounded Zulus. So he takes his vow of celibacy when he is nursing the wounded Zulus. And I think this particular link is extraordinary. Okay. Now, 2 decades ago, in a lengthy paper on the politics of Gandhi's sexuality, I suggested, contrary to the still dominant view that Gandhi's outlook was characterized by an unhealthy and even repulsive form of sexual puritanism, that it is critical to distinguish between his repudiation of the sexual act on the one hand, and on the other hand, his love of intimacy and sexuality. Right? There's a difference between his repudiation of the sexual act and his love of intimacy and sexuality. For example, sexuality also includes touch. And we know that the idea of touch was very central, throughout for him, even until the last days of his life. For example, the proximity to Abba and Manu, right? The so-called walking sticks that he had towards the end of his life. Now, when he took the vow of celibacy, Gandhi did not thereby abjure touch. He doesn't abjure touch. That's, in fact, remember now that he's taking this vow when he's nursing the wounded Zulus, and we'll see how intricate this is, right? When he took the vow of celibacy, Gandhi did not thereby abjure touch nor proximity to the bodies of others. Both, I would argue, entirely central to his conception of nursing, right? Touch and proximity to the bodies of others. It is a proximity to the bodies of lepers and touch which made it possible for Gandhi to actually attend to leprosy patients when no one else would come even close to them. Let us hear what he has to say. I quote, "I was delighted on reaching headquarters to hear that our main work was to be the nursing of the wounded Zulus. The medical officer in charge welcomed us. He said the white people were not willing nurses for the wounded Zulus, that their wounds were festering, and that he was at his wits' end. He hailed our arrival as a godsend for these innocent people, and he equipped us with bandages, disinfectants, etc., and took us to the improvised hospital. The Zulus were delighted to see us." And quote, the festering wounds of which he speaks were a consequence of the floggings by which the Zulus were browbeaten into submission. That's how they got these festering wounds, because they were flogged. These floggings had caused severe sores which had been left unattended. Their protocols of war, more precisely the color line of which W.B. Du Bois had spoken 3 years ago in The Souls of Black Folk, prevented the British from tending to the wounded Zulus. And so we have seen Gandhi remarks that, quote, white people were not willing nurses for the wounded Zulus. So Gandhi, who had been appointed Sergeant Major of the Corps, commanded a number of men who assisted in tending to these wounded Zulus. Here he resumes his narrative. Quote, "The white soldiers used to peep through the railings that separated us from them and tried to dissuade us from attending to the wounds. And as we would not heed them, they became enraged and poured unspeakable abuse on the Zulus." End quote. So these white people are peering through these railings, seeing the Indians attend to these Zulus, right? White people were unwilling to nurse the Zulus, but their voyeurism, as they peep through the railings while the Indians attended to the wounded men, is glaring, right? So it's like, you see, it's like, for example, you're taking care of leprosy patients, someone is, and everyone else is afraid of approaching them, of touching them, but they want to see. There is that voyeurism. And so what Gandhi is in fact actually also alerting us to is the fact that nurses are very often doing things, tending to patients, removing their bedpan, for example, which fill others with distaste, sometimes with revulsion, But nonetheless, one understands they're doing something which needs to be done, which is valuable. So there's an element of voyeurism. Right? It's fascinating how Gandhi actually describes what is really transpiring in this short account. Okay. White people were unwilling to nurse the Zulus, but their voyeurism as they peeped through the railings while the Indians attended to the wounded men is glaring. Sight has been privileged among the senses, at least in the Western tradition, but Gandhi's conduct points to the phenomenological importance of touch in his worldview. Right? What is equally inescapable is the magnanimous ethics of hospitality behind the nursing of the Zulus. Though Gandhi craved to be accepted as a subject of the British Empire, he plunges headlong into nursing the empire's enemies, right? Because that's what the Zulus were to the British. So that brings me to my conclusion. So what might Gandhi then have thought? And back to, as I said, the whole series of reflections was really occasioned by the coronavirus pandemic, when I first started thinking about this. So what might Gandhi then have thought of the coronavirus pandemic, the jeopardy in which the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people around the world was placed, the enormous toll it has taken of human lives, and even considering his own stated passion for nursing, of the advice of scientists and doctors that each of us should practice social distancing. Before turning to this question, it is necessary to reflect on what would be obvious to most people. When Gandhi averts to his passion for nursing, or invokes the occasions when he felt called upon to nurse the ill or the wounded, he calls to mind a profession that over the course of the 20th century became heavily feminized. A profession that became heavily feminized. The feminist critique of nursing as a discourse, practice, and profession has not unreasonably torn to shreds the assumption, one indubitably shared perhaps both by Florence Nightingale and Gandhi, that women have a natural aptitude for nursing, or that they are by nature, disposition, and training better suited to the care of the sick than men. And we have to remember, of course, that when we think of nursing, we should not only be thinking of nursing in nursing homes and in hospitals, because the vast majority of the nursing that is done is actually done at home. And it is done largely by women, and it is, of course, all unpaid labor. Right? But, of course, that would be the feminist critique, that it's unpaid labor, but the idea that everything should be remunerated is something that Gandhi, of course, would, I think, have actually had a serious problem with, right? Which is to say that there should be other kinds of work that should not be remunerated either, including the work of teachers, for example, because teachers might possibly live on alms if you had a society that was really, so to speak, progressive, right? So, this has to do with his whole conception of how one thinks of the question of labor to begin with, and why it is that we attach monetary significance to the question of labor. Right? But what I'm suggesting here is that in Gandhi's formulations, there is already some kind of attentiveness to these questions. Now, feminists have put into serious question, of course, as I've suggested, the supposition that women are especially called upon to be self-sacrificing. Right? There is a large literature on the subject, but it suffices to introduce briefly only two considerations. First, there is no gainsaying the fact, no denying the fact, that Nightingale forcefully advocated for women as nurses rather than as doctors. But the feminist critique is perhaps not sufficiently mindful of the fact that even in mid-19th century Britain and Europe, nursing was scarcely a profession for women from respectable homes. So what we don't really adequately understand is that nursing, far from being feminized right from the outset, was in fact actually for many decades, for centuries, before Florence Nightingale brings women into the public sphere through nursing was in fact carried out largely by men. It was carried out largely by men, and there is some data to support that argument as well. Nursing was commonly left to those, when women did it, who came from impoverished families, or to those engaged in prostitution. To this extent, Nightingale's endeavor was to make nursing open to respectable or educated women, introduce professional standards, furnish women with secure employment, and liberate women from the tyranny of the home. Secondly, Gandhi's own predilection for nursing can also profitably be viewed within the ambit of his larger design, both of feminizing the public sphere and in practice controverting the assigned gender roles that his own writings sometimes appear to endorse. Right? And I want to just elaborate upon this point very briefly. It's a critical point, of course, because what I'm suggesting is that Gandhi's embrace of nursing, his own predilection for it, can be viewed within this larger ambit of what I have called his attempt to feminize the public sphere. For example, what does he do with fasting? See, he takes fasting, which was in the private domain, in the domain of the house, and he brings it into the public domain. He brings the body into the body politic. All right. The fasting is a very good illustration of what I'm describing as a feminization of the public sphere. Feminization of the public sphere is not simply, an attempt to bring women into the public sphere by saying, all right, we're going to give you roles within the non-cooperation movement, the picketing of liquor shops. It was all picked that way because the reason it was picked that way is because the consumption of liquor was something that women deplored, because they found that their menfolk would bring back their salaries and squander it all on liquor, which is why in India, as I'm sure all of you know, payday is the day when liquor shops have to be closed, right? So what I'm suggesting here is that we should, I've only given one or two illustrations here of what I'm describing as the feminization of the public sphere. Some scholars have suggested that this is an argument made far too easily by people working on Gandhi, sometimes like myself. But recall that when Nathuram Godse assassinated Gandhi, and then if you read his long speech, in his own defense, one of the things he says is that I had to do away with the old man, because what was this person doing? He brings fasting, spinning, weaving. He listens to the inner voice. He says only women do these kinds of things. These are the signs of someone who's weak. And of course, Nathuram Godse was quite certain that fortunes could not be guided by an effeminate man. Right? And he's very clear that this is one of the reasons that Gandhi has to be done away with. So imagine Gandhi, the nurse, and Nathuram would say, well, that's all we need now to make India into a strong, muscular nation state. And this is before the nuclear age, So I think it's that what you have to bear in mind when we're really looking at what I'm describing as the ethics, poetics, and what we might describe as the socio-politics of nursing. The beginning point of a Gandhian view of the pandemic is perhaps to recognize that he would have been one with Nightingale in holding to the view that whatever a patient can do to himself, it is better. Whatever a patient can do to himself, it is better. He was very much his own doctor and a theorist of a biopolitics which placed the responsibility of well-being both upon each individual and the state. He knew enough about public health and the importance of sanitation to discern that the advance of the plague in Johannesburg was imminent. And he was sharply critical of the local authorities, having pointed out in a letter to the Johannesburg Press a public letter that he wrote to the press on 4th April 1904 that, quote, but for the criminal neglect of the Johannesburg municipality, the outbreak would never have occurred. A statement that he stood by months later, as is revealed in a letter he addressed to the Indian member of the British Parliament, Dadabhai Naoroji, on October 31st. It cannot be doubted that the words he used, criminal neglect, would have formed part of his indictment of how the coronavirus pandemic was managed by governments of most states, and of course India as well. But on the issue of social distancing, he would likely have displayed some ambivalence. While he would have been critical of the reckless disregard for the lives of others manifested in the behavior of those who are unable to look beyond their own wants, comforts, and drives, it is inconceivable that he would not have found it disconcerting and unacceptable that some hid behind the excuse of this pandemic to shun their neighbors, introduce new hierarchies, and drive a wedge between themselves and others whom they imagine are their social inferiors. Social distancing, Gandhi would have said, can create its own forms of ghettoization. Gandhi held to the view, so this is my last concluding paragraph, Gandhi held to the view that there are laws of compensation at work in this universe, however opaque they may be to us. The comparatively clean air in the wake of the shuttering of the world economy, for instance, is perhaps a sign to human beings to be mindful of the devastation they have wrought upon planet Earth. But Gandhi was not one to only philosophize. It is impossible to imagine him not present on the scene, tending to the sick and comforting members of their families. Even as his compassion was known to be boundless, nowhere more was this in evidence than in the fearless walk that he took through riot-torn Noakhali just months before his assassination, comforting the afflicted while accepting the taunts of some as though they were bouquets of flowers. Gandhi was also tough as nails, and I suspect that he would have punished himself to the hilt in working around the clock, organizing relief workers and cajoling people not to rely on government handouts, but to make themselves useful and apply their ingenuity. Gandhi did not require a pandemic to discover, as is true of many of us, that many of those who are among the lowest paid workers are in fact the most essential. His relentless critique of industrial modernity has led many people into believing that Gandhi was opposed to science, but that is far from being the case. He was a scientist in his own fashion, ceaselessly testing the truth of every proposition, but more critically, he was opposed to scientism. While he would have respected scientific advice, I think it can safely be said that Gandhi would also have said that we cannot leave our understanding of the pandemic and of its social, political, and philosophical implications to the scientists alone. Because the pandemonium engendered by the pandemic is ultimately a reflection of the unrest within each of us and within Homo sapiens as a whole. Magnificent as the nurses may have been in tending to the sick and the diseased, we all, that is Gandhi's insight, are called upon to nurse this earth back to health. Something which can only begin with the recognition that as a species we are less likely essential than we have imagined ourselves to be. Thank you.
Now I would request Professor Joseph to please give his comments and his remarks on this topic.
Thank you so much, Professor Vinay Lal, for your excellent presentation and Gandhi's passion for nursing. Your presentation is very significant because you have contextualized in the post-pandemic world in which we are living. As you have rightly pointed out at the beginning that the observation of World Leprosy Day on 30th of January is not a historical accident. Even though I don't know how many of sitting in this web room are aware of it. I had the opportunity to read some of the literature when I was writing an article in my mother tongue. There I had the opportunity to read and reflect Gandhi's contribution in the field of nursing or the medical care. I was amazed by the report which you have made, RAN Plague Committee report on plague, and the role played by Gandhi. Gandhi was not a doctor, but he warned the authorities that an epidemic is going to happen. This shows his scientific attitude. And also he took care of, from Emily Blake, who passed away while serving the people. There were 3 people, but Gandhi's experiments created sense because out of the 3, 2 survived. And also you have pointed out rightly, it was while nursing the Zulus, he took the vow of brahmacharya. This point needs a lot of elaboration. I was surprised when I reread what appeared in Indian Opinion in 1905, 21/1/1905, that is not in Gandhi's name, our correspondent. I have reproduced that whole 21 points in my article, basically because the 21 points are much significant and we have much to learn how whatever the points which were discussed during the corona pandemic, the seclusion and all those things, Gandhi himself thought about it. Even though he has not written in his name, it is very clear that what was the 21 instructions, that gives a fresh insight on Gandhi's way of looking at it. The US understanding of the whole subject is very nuanced and it is very interesting. Especially, I was fascinated by the idea of bringing private domain into the public domain and feminizing of public sphere, linking it with Gandhi's passion for nursing. See, Gandhi's Sevagram Ashram is a witness to Gandhi's passion for nursing. I had the opportunity to some of the people like N. Krishnasamy, who was secretary to Acharya Kripalani, how he was served by Gandhi, not that the stalwarts Gandhi used to serve. And I was amazed, and there was a joke that if you want to go near to Gandhi and want his care and love, you should fall sick. And Gandhi's service to Prajnash Shastri from 1939 to 1942 is something which signifies his passion for nursing. Gandhi had to leave important political meetings to serve Prajnash Shastri. You see, Prajnash Shastri was in an advanced stage, and because of the care of Gandhi, he could better his health condition. And we are seeing in Sevagram Ashram that he is solemnizing the marriages. And recently, when a group of students from different universities came, they visited, I took them to the Prajaresh Shastri Kuti, and they were amazed by the words which we have depicted there, how he looked upon. And one of the students was saying that this is similar to the treatment of the people during the pandemic situation. I think after a very elaborate discussion, I'll be doing an injustice to the people if I comment on such a very illuminating, and it was an enriching experience for all of us. Now it is the time for us to have discussion that is very important, hearing from Professor Vinay Lal. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I consider it as a great honor and privilege to chair a session none other than Professor Vinay Lal. Thank you so much.
I would thank all the esteemed speakers for their insights and enlightening thoughts on this very important topic. Now, I would request all the students to please post their questions in the chat box or come live by raising their hands to ask their questions from Professor Vinay Lal. Yes, sir, you can please come, you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Vinay Lal, for this very, very interesting lecture. I have read some of your articles in APW on Gandhi. Also, I listened to you in person. I have a couple of queries. First thing is that I like the way you connected Gandhi's care with the act of nursing and also the notion of ahimsa. Very, very interesting connect. And also the idea of feminizing the public, the body politic. I really appreciate that idea. But that I think undergirds a critique of modernity's notion of muscular nation and also, muscular nation. I understand that. My first problem is this. You said about ahimsa and the debate Tagore and Gandhi had on Swadeshi, etc., Charkha, etc., fine, burning of foreign laws, etc., fine. I have this problem. As I understand, I haven't read all the 98 volumes of collected works, but I have read some of the books. Gandhi's notion of ahimsa is philosophically built on the Jaina notion of Anekantavada. Because if the opponent has a view, so that also is linked to the epistemology of Asyadvada, the 7 logical predicates. Now, as I understand, the Jaina notion says that every view is perspectively true. Perspectively true in a given truth condition. Now, if that is the case, that does not give me an evaluative model to assess that this is truer than the other view. Because, the 7 tenables say that everything is perspectively true. So that gives me a problem. At the same time, Gandhi would even negotiate even with his opponent. He says that even my opponent is true in many of the times he or she is saying. So in that case, how does one ascribe ontological primacy to the truth force Gandhi is holding on to? To put my question in a very, very, ordinary way, how do I say that Gandhi's notion of truth and ahimsa is much more valuable than Hitler's notion of truth and racism? If both are, perspectively true. That's one question. The The second thing which I have an idea is this. You beautifully highlighted the notion of touch. Beautiful. I think that's something new. Touch. And Gandhi's notion of brahmacharya does not exclude the notion of intimacy and touch. That's a very, very fine, I think, very, very interesting aspect. In this aspect, how do you look at, you mentioned Naokoli, and how do you look at Gandhi's most important yajna to testify to himself that he's performing yajna and he's a perfect yogi and he has control over passions by his act of sleeping with his niece in Naokoli? Because I think they're and that's a point where everybody was anti-Gandhi, including Nehru and Nirmal Kumar Bose. Everybody was anti-Gandhi. So that is one point. I look at it as yajna, a sacrifice, because he said that if the Muslims and Hindus are fighting because I have failed in my yajna to control my passions. Therefore, I need to ask myself, am I a perfect, a yogi, a kind of person who does this? A third one is very, very, very minor point. You said that in Semitic traditions, the lepers are excluded. But I am of the view that Gandhi has read the Christian scriptures, the Bible. He has read it. And in the Bible, we have a very, very, all the synoptic gospels, will testify that Jesus indeed touched the lepers and healed them.
Yes.
He invited them to his fellowship. 10 lepers came and he touched them and healed them. And only one came back to thank him. Therefore, he says that. And after this, we have Francis of Assisi. After his momentous metanoia, where he gave up his father, silk merchant's possession, gave his own clothes back to father. When he goes back into the world, he meets a group of lepers first, and he hugs them as brothers. So I remember here Damu Gandhi's idea of Francis Assisi, the crown of Francis Assisi, and with Sona Narayan, he had that drama. He would image also Gandhi in that sense. So I am not sure that if you say, generally speaking, the tradition of Semitic religions, including Christianity, would do that. At least in Christian tradition, we have Father Damien who went to South Africa. He was also this. So we have this idea of touch. What you call bodiality, so excluded. The periphery is brought into the center. So that's one of the comments. Okay. Last but one point. I really am I'm interested in the idea of Gandhi's effort to feminize the body politic, and by brings in the idea of the body. Now, as I understand, Gandhi's idea of the self and reality is more tantric, where reality is neither fully masculine nor feminine, but it's kind of, we can use that Sanskrit word, Ardhanarishwara. Yes. That's the case. So, and is it in that, for example, Gandhi, my mother, that book also tells me that. So, is Gandhi's idea of nursing, ahimsa, truth force, all these are philosophically based on these ideas of reality.
Devasis, I have to interrupt you. There are others also.
This is my last question. I finished that.
Yeah, please.
I finished that. I wound up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you for those lovely comments. I'll respond to all of them because I think you've raised some points that provide a good way into the discussion. Let me begin with a question of this and leprosy. So what I said is exactly the case. Remember, when I said that even in the Semitic world, in the Semitic world, there was this whole conception of distancing the lepers, marginalizing them, ostracizing them. Now, of course, that is precisely Jesus' radical intervention. Because you have to read Leviticus.
Yeah,
you have to go to the Old
Testament.
Right.
You have to read Deuteronomy and Leviticus to see exactly how lepers were dealt with. So what you're saying, of course, I agree with, which is precisely why, of course, Gandhi was deeply moved by portions of the New Testament, including the Sermon on the Mount. Right? I wouldn't dispute what you're saying at all. I'm in agreement with this point. If I had elaborated upon it, that would have described, of course, the transition in the Semitic world, because Christianity, of course, is a Semitic faith as well, or an Abrahamic faith. But what I was describing here was before the advent of Jesus. It is precisely Jesus's radical interventions which begin to produce awareness of what we might describe as this politics. And touch is very important for Jesus too, for in the whole act of healing and so on. Okay. Now, with regard to the question of the great yajna, okay, and again, you're right that when Gandhi undertakes this experiment towards the end of his life, where he goes to bed with Manu, and actually there were 2-3. Even Shushila Nair was involved in this. Okay, and as I mentioned, I wrote a very long article. I mean, it's 40 pages, published 20 years ago on this very question, where I explored it at very great length. And I know exactly what you mean when you say that he had no defenders. I remember on a purely anecdotal level, I mean, when I was growing up, my mother, much like women of her generation, admired Gandhi, but she said, one thing I cannot understand, I cannot forgive him for, is precisely this incident that you're talking about. But you have, in a sense, answered your own question. Why? Because take Manu's little book. What is that book called? Bapu? What's the rest of the title? My Mother. You see, when Manu was interviewed, on this question, subsequently, she said, "What's the fuss all about? I just jumped into bed with him just as I would with my mother." Right? Now, that's one way in which you can take it. Of course, we can have a long philosophical discussion. I don't think it's possible at this point to understand what Gandhi meant by yajna, what is required of that. But I think the critical point, which is not mentioned in your intervention, and of course I hadn't because it's not a talk on that, is the following. This is, I think, what gives us a peg to get into this question. That is that this yajna was critically important because Gandhi saw this moment in what was happening in Noakhali as a fundamental problem in his comprehension, awareness of ahimsa. That is that this problem in Noakhali was a cosmological problem as well. It represented, on the other hand, a problem within his own comprehension of ahimsa. So what he had to determine for himself was whether his whole lifelong endeavor to dialogue with the idea of ahimsa had been, in some ways, abysmally a failure, or had been abysmally misunderstood by him. That is why this yajna was required. And of course, there are questions which I think are legitimate questions, and that has to do with, well, did this kind of yajna actually violate his philosophy of care? Because to care for others means to understand their sentiments. So what was his relationship to Manu and Abba and Shushila, right, Nair, and all of that? But in my view, it is precisely the fact that he undertook this with women who were in close proximity to him. He doesn't just, do it with someone out of the blue. It is precisely because he understood that they were partaking of his world of ahimsa, that they had been with him long enough, as it were, they had been tutored, and they had themselves tutored themselves in these practices of ahimsa. That would be my response to this, but I think, as you recognize, this requires a very long, protracted discussion. Now, going back to your first point, that's a very complex matter. I agree with you. But I don't know if I agree entirely that I would put singular emphasis on the Jaina view of Anek Anantavad. I have long had a discussion with my friend Professor Ashish Nandi about this whole matter of who were Gandhi's gurus, okay? Because he has written often and argued often that, look, Gandhi's gurus were all, from the West. I mean, there was John Ruskin, there was Tolstoy, there was Henry David Thoreau. And I told him that, actually Gandhi, and that's a view that I have, and this is where I'll come back to the Jaina thing, because even the Anek Anantavad, I mean, there is a Jaina guru there too. That's Rai Chand Bhai or Rajachandra, right? Because how did Gandhi really imbibe Jaina philosophy and worldview? And as you know, he had a long discussion with him. They have a long correspondence, the two of them. And of course, the Jaina worldview was very much something that he might in some ways have imbibed simply from where he was in the 19th century, the social, cultural, religious milieu of Porbandar, his own mother. This was a Vaishnava Jaina culture that in which he was really brought up. There is that element of it. But let me put these strands together to make a different point. So number one, that think of all the gurus that he had, and my response to Professor Nandi was, and still is, that Gandhi actually had no gurus. That even if none of these people had been around, he would have been what he was. Because you cannot, when you have too many gurus, then you have no guru at all either. Okay? I mean, your number of gurus, Gokhale was also a guru. I mean, you can just keep on adding to the list, frankly, of people that Gandhi says, I just fell in love with Gokhale when I saw him the first time. He says that of several other people, really, as well. Okay? So this is how I would respond to that. We need a very short interruption of 10 seconds because I'm getting a sign on my computer. I'm in a hotel room that my battery is going to go dead. So I have to just attach this computer to, and you'll have to excuse the background here because it's in a hotel room. So just 1 second, let me attach my computer to a electrical cord so that it doesn't die down on me. Okay, all right. Okay, so this is the first thing in response to what you had said about Anek Anantavad, which is that now, so your philosophical objection here is, or problem is that how does one really determine, okay, whose position is more truthful? Because what is Anek Anantavad? It is the many perspectiveness of truth, as it were, right? The simplest way in which this is sometimes often interpreted is the view that no one position is entirely true. Okay? Every position may have some element of truth in it, and what Satyagraha seeks to do is to actually, so the first step in Satyagraha is to elicit the possible truth in your opponent's point of view. Okay. Now, instead of discussing it in the milieu of Jaina philosophy, let's look at it this way. See, Gandhi had many objections to violence. So those objections are on philosophical grounds, they're on ethical grounds. And when I say philosophical, let's divide that into, it's on ontological grounds and on epistemological grounds, on ethical grounds, and on pragmatic grounds. So think of it this way now, and I won't elaborate what all of those four are. But some are, pragmatic is self-evident for Gandhi. That is that the pragmatic objection to violence is, it's not successful. It just doesn't work. You think you've defeated the enemy continues to haunt you. And of course, as Romain Rolland and then Gandhi subsequently, the insight there is, victory is more catastrophic for the victor than it is for the vanquished, right? Okay. So there, what I'm suggesting is very simply the following. Let's take Dr. Devasya Anthony's view seriously and say, well, how does one determine it? Well, one determines it not simply in the light of what Anekanantavad says. One determines this question, how one adjudicates between different truth claims, by also considering the other objections that Gandhi had to violence, such as the pragmatic objection, the ontological objection, right? Because Gandhi would say that, well, let's supposing that there is some truth claim behind a view advocated by Joseph Stalin or Hitler. But then on pragmatic grounds, you could say, well, this is likely to produce such results. Violence of this kind always produces such results. That might be one way in which you might adjudicate it. In a strictly philosophical way, of course, though, then we would have to say that how does one adjudicate behind competing claims? Well, clearly, Gandhi does believe, by the way, in such things as evidence. Why does he go to Champaran when he is asked by Rajendra Shukla to intervene and say, look at the conditions of the farmers, the indigo farmers? What does he do? He first spends months talking to them, accumulating something called evidence, because obviously one can say certain positions have more merit than other kinds of positions, right? So I think that, again, we would have to have a very long, protracted discussion if we were try to sort this out, but I think there are ways in which one can certainly make a claim that certain positions have more merit and therefore are more deserving of our attention and have a greater proximity actually to the notion of ahimsa than other positions do, right? Ahimsa and satya both, right? And then finally, the question of feminizing, androgenizing. When I say feminizing the public sphere, what I'm really speaking about is, of course, androgenizing it, because the public sphere was wholly masculine to begin with. So to feminize it doesn't mean that you will be able to eliminate the masculine element. Not that Gandhi would have thought it desirable to do that anyhow, because recall, of course, his position always that a man should continue to be a man but should cultivate the woman within him, that the woman should continue to be a woman but should cultivate the man within her, right? So in this sense, the feminizing of the sphere that I'm speaking about is, in a manner of speaking, the androgenizing of the public sphere. Okay, I hope I have at least attended to all the questions. Yeah.